Hey and welcome back to Beyond Systems, it's Egwin here. Today I'm answering another request that I recently got, and it's really an absolutely fascinating and interesting topic and sort of tackles the whole idea of restructuring the body from the opposite side than we would normally look at it. So what exactly is it? The question that I got, or the request that I got, was actually more of an observation. And it was okay, what if, say, the arches of the feet are collapsed? And then I don't really pay attention to that, but I train the rest of my body. I train my core, I train the coordination between my core and my hip stability and stuff like that. Can that positively impact the arches of the feet without paying attention to it? So, to wrap that up in a more generalized way, if you have a structural problem in some area of the body, does it help to train other areas, and will that have a positive impact on the problems on the problem area itself? I think it's absolutely fascinating to think about the things like that. And now let me give you some ideas on how that actually works. The quick answer is yes, there will be an impact. Yes, potentially also a positive one. But now let's dive a little bit deeper into it, because it's not really this totally black and white in this specific situation. So just training something in the body doesn't necessarily solve all the problems that you have. And here is how this all works. What's the reason for it? Let's stick with the example of having collapsed arches of the feet and then training your core, training your hip area. Let's turn this whole thing around for a second. Let's look at it. What happens if the arches of the feet collapse? When the arches of the feet are collapsed, I know there are different possible reasons for that, but what happens after that for the rest of the structure is that typically the knees slightly sink towards the inside, which again affects the pelvic tilt. So when the knees are dropped more to the inside, then it's more difficult to actually drop the back of the pelvis back down. So you will be held more in an anterior pelvic tilt position, so as if the pelvis was a bowl of water where you try to pour out water out towards the front. So this will be another result of it. The next result, when we move up in the structure in the lumbar spine, will be if the pelvis cannot drop back into a neutral position anymore, or not as easily, then what happens is simply that pressure out of your own weight and through moving, through walking or running and stuff like that, pressure will be transferred into the lumbar spine more harshly, because that natural bouncing of the pelvis, this dynamic stabilization and force transmission that the pelvic ring typically is important for, cannot happen as efficiently anymore. Let's take it another step higher. We have this central lumbar spine area, and then the next thing that's directly affected by collapsed arches is the tension levels in our shoulders and also in our cervical spine, and especially the two first vertebrae and the suboccipital muscles, and eventually also the jaw joint. So whatever happens down there in our foundation has a ripple effect all the way upwards through the structure. Now, what happens if instead of correcting the arches of the feet with whatever method, obviously there are passive methods to restructure the arches, which more often than not is just using some inlay soles in your shoes, which is not really a good idea in the mid to long term. Why? Because it just helps the body to unlearn how to use this structure properly even further. So I'd always suggest, yes, there are medical indications where it's important to have some inlay soles, but I would never ever use them 24/7. I would always use them in conjunction with actual movement, with training, with active conscious restructuring of those areas in order to have the best possible results. Now, let's dive into the other thing. What happens now if instead of focusing on restructuring the arches, my focus is on correcting my core? So there can be a number of different reasons why the core is off balance. There might be a muscle weakness in some areas. There might be a coordinational problem in the core. And when I talk about the core in this specific case, I don't just mean our abdominal muscles, which is often referred to as the core. But when we talk about our core and our hips, which in my definition tightly link with the core, they are part of the core function, then it's important to also take a look at our glutes, our hamstrings, and our hip flexors, as well as our quads. Because all of those muscles, together with the muscles in the lumbar spine and the abdominal muscles, which is the typical core definition, all of those muscles together have to work in perfect harmony in order to keep the pelvis at peak performance in terms of a solid, stable environment for the upper body to rest on, quote unquote, a force transmitting element to take loads from our weight from the upper body while moving, and to transmit power from our legs upwards through the pelvic ring into the spine, and then eventually into all of those connective tissue tension lines that run up to the rest of the body. So this whole core, as I am using the term, is really a functional unit between our lumbar spine, the lower parts of the rib cage, the abdominal muscles, the lumbar spine muscles, the hip joints, and also all the muscles that surround that, like the glutes, and everything that connects basically to the pelvis, to keep it simple. All right, now, there are potentially a number of different reasons why the core is out of whack. Maybe even the reason why the core is out of whack might contribute or create the problem with the collapsed arches. But that's something I want to discuss a little later. So whatever it is that actually created the imbalance in the core, if you train your core, not just pure strength training, that's extremely important in this case, but really targeted, very specific, individually targeted training for you and for your specific structure, for your specific needs in this area, where you pay attention to movement quality, where you pay attention to stability, not stiffness, stability, functional stability, where you pay attention to coordination between muscle groups, how your glutes and your abdominal muscles, for example, work together to keep the pelvic ring leveled between them, ideally. Sometimes the hamstrings get too tight and then take part of the job that the glutes should be doing, which in parts also takes function out of your abdominal muscles. And so there is a lot of functional things going on, a lot of connections going on. But, so, if you train your core in a functional, individually targeted way, where you teach the muscles around your hip, around your pelvic, around your lumbar region to work together in the most efficient way again, then yes, it can have a positive effect on structures upward and structures downward of that central area that you are working on. In other words, if you do this kind of training, yes, there is a good chance of you also creating, and that's important, a favorable environment for the arches to become more healthy again. Let me repeat that. You are quite likely to create a favorable environment for the arches to become healthy again. It's very important to understand that just creating this favorable environment will have a positive impact on literally the structure of the arches already. But as long as in the next step, the arches are not also taught how to play their role actively, this favorable environment will always be a sort of in a fighting situation. You create a favorable environment for the arches by optimizing your core function. Awesome. But as long as you do not also teach the muscles in your feet, the intrinsic and extrinsic muscles in your feet and lower legs, I've done a video about that, then you'll always have a stressful relationship between your core and your arch structures. Like I said, the favorable environment that you can create can help you to have more intense and more sustainable positive results with restructuring the arches of the feet. But I would definitely suggest and say that it's still quite important to target those structures in the next step as well. Those structures meaning the arches in the next step as well. So what I'm saying is, if in this specific example of the arches and the core, you choose to work on your core as the first point of contact with correcting your posture and your structure, and you realize, wow, okay, that somehow also positively affects my feet, that's awesome, and yes, that absolutely can happen, but don't just rest in that core working area. Perceive that, and then choose to consciously also do something for the arches, so that now you use this favorable environment. This helps you because it takes out the stress that is in the structure, so the structure will react a lot quicker and more sustainable to any additional positive impulse you put in there. So when you train your core and you realize, oh, okay, that somehow I stand more stable, I feel my knees less and stuff like that, awesome. But then pay attention to your feet as well. Use the favorable environment that you created. Use that quote-unquote relaxing of the strain that typically rests on the feet, that reduction of that strain that typically rests on the feet, and work in this area as well for the best possible results. Now, earlier I mentioned that, again, there might be a lot of different reasons for why the core is out of whack and so on. And the reason why I mentioned that, touching onto it now, is that depending on what's the actual cause of the structural imbalance of the body, everything that I just described to you will work more or less well and smoothly. So for instance, if the imbalance in the arches, to stick with this example one more time, if the imbalance in the arches of the feet actually originates from a misuse of the core, wow, awesome. Now you have a really good chance of restructuring those arches, of creating a favorable environment. Still, you need to do the second step work on the arches as well, but it will go very, very smoothly. If the pelvic instability or the pelvic disposition and problem originates from collapsed arches. So the origin of the problem, quote unquote, is in how you use your feet, or just this collapsed structure down there. If that is the origin and you work up in your core region, well, it will still work. It will not work as smoothly because you have to put more effort into correcting your core, as the structure down below, that is an even more chronic process, that is even older in terms of the not really smooth pattern, in terms of the problematic pattern in the body. You'll constantly work against that pattern. So it will be more difficult in that specific case to actually have positive effects on your core that then also positively affect the feet. It's more difficult. It will require more work in the core area, but it is still possible. And then there is another component to all of this, which is obviously the psychological component. And I always bring this in as well. Psychological components have a massive impact on the physical body and vice versa. So if you change something in your structure, if you optimize something in your structure, I always urge all the people that I work with to also pay close attention to shifts and changes that happen in their psychological state. Why is that? Because if you do not pay attention to things that happen as a result of the work that you do, then again, you will have a pattern, this time not a structural, this time a, say, emotional or psychological pattern that works against that change. However, if you change something in the structure and you also pay attention to, oh yeah, okay, just for a moment there, while I corrected that structure and while I was actually standing with more ease or walking with more ease, this also changed my psychological state ever so slightly, maybe 5%, maybe 10%. If you have a perception for that, recognition of change is absolute key to manifest more of that change. I say that again. Recognition of change is key to manifest more of that positive change in a quicker and more sustainable way. Very important to understand. So basically, by paying attention to those subtle changes, you help yourself. It's not that just because you do that, you don't have to do anything at all. What has happened is you do this, you try to perceive, and once you perceive, you get this changing of patterns gets supercharged. Recognition is important because every single thing that you pull up into your conscious awareness suddenly gets highlighted, gets more attention, gets more energy, and is something that the body automatically brings into this space of, oh, we can actually change that. We can impact that area as well. It's not just some, well, totally passive aspect of ourselves that just lives and is impacted from the outside, that just exists and just has to deal with an outside impulse. No, every single thing that you can consciously perceive in your body, immediately it tells you, it creates the experience for you that it is something that you can impact actively, consciously, deliberately, and positively, as well as negatively, but if you set your intention to improvement positively. So it gives you more options, it gives you more choice, and that is so extremely important. So coming back to our example, if psychological components are at the core of why, at the center of why there might be some imbalance in your core or the collapsed arches and stuff like that, which is quite likely actually, then again, it is possible to affect the rest of the structure, say the arches, with training the core as well. It is absolutely possible. But again, it will be a little bit more difficult when the psychological part is not also readjusted, which you can simply do by paying attention to it and by recognizing it. So you bring it into the space where you actually create positive change. I'm going to do a separate video about that sometime in the future, I suppose, because that's really a very important concept, and it just highlights what a human is actually capable of. And like I always say, for me, it's always very important to educate people on the possibilities they carry within themselves already. And really, if you were taught those possibilities as a child, I promise you it would be easier to access those possibilities that are already within yourself than to use any kind of technology to somehow create a workaround for something that, like I said, is already as a possibility within you. And that's the main focus of my trainings, of my teaching, of everything that I do, is educating people to the possibilities they have within themselves, because that's what creates freedom and freedom of choice and possibilities to improve for every single person. All right. Now, coming back to how does this actually work? Well, we have our muscles, we have our connective tissue, we have our bones, and all of those things, they obviously work together in order to keep us balanced. We also have hydrodynamic aspects in the body, and those liquid waves that run through the body, they have a tight emotional connection, but they are also important in stabilizing and in moving the body. And I keep mentioning that as well. It's what I call hydrodynamic locomotion. Sorry for that. Hydrodynamic locomotion, I described that for the first time about 12 years ago in a training that I was giving. And it really is the more or less deliberate use of liquids in the body and to stabilize the structure and to actually even move. Nowadays, in modern fascia connective tissue research, we know that the liquid content in the structure is extremely important for connective tissue health, for muscle health, and so on. And that those hydrodynamic aspects actually play a major role in stabilizing and in actually keeping this whole tensegral connective tissue structure of the body healthy and at peak efficiency. And it's also involved in trauma patterns and stuff like that. But again, this leads a little bit too far out of the box that we created for today's video / podcast. All right, now what does happen is when you change the tension patterns in your body through training, say a muscle that was not trained for a long time is reduced in diameter just because it lost muscle mass. Now you train that muscle again, you increase muscle mass, you automatically put a little bit more tension into the connective tissue system, which is not necessarily a bad thing. Tension is not always a bad thing. You need a certain basic tension level in the body, otherwise tensegral structures won't work anymore. So this concept of you have your bones, but you also have connective tissue that, similar to a sailboat where you have those lines running up to the mast, you need these tension components to actually stabilize the structure. And that is something that's basically the core of why creating a structural change in your core, training your core properly, coordinating the muscles in the core in such a way that the pelvic ring is balanced naturally so that the muscles don't work against each other, but they also do not stiffen the structure. Once you have that, then you also correct the pulse on the connective tissue system, which is exactly what I mentioned earlier, that element that creates a favorable environment. And so this is extremely important. And it's also, that's where really the fun in all of this lies, how every single thing is connected. If you pull on your ear, on the cartilage on your ear, you can influence the whole rest of the body, the passive structures in the body. And the ear is not an exception here. It's literally every single part of the body is tightly linked and connected with the rest. And it's fascinating how all of those areas, they really work together quite smoothly. When we're talking about the pelvic ring, just let me bring this in real quick, because I mentioned a couple of times the difference between stiffness and stability. And that is a very important topic as well. I did a separate video, but just let me touch onto that here for a minute so you actually understand this concept without having to jump to another podcast or video blog. All right, so with every single joint in the body, we have muscles on both sides of that joint. When you take a look at the pelvic ring, basically we have our back muscles and we have our abdominal muscles and we have our thigh muscles in front of the femur bone down towards the legs, and we have our hamstrings in the back. So I'm just simplifying this down as much as possible. So basically, what we need is those muscles, not even talking about the connective tissue, just the muscle function. What we need is those muscles in the front and in the back, on top and below the pelvic ring, to work in sync so that the pelvic ring is stable within the framework of natural movement. Stability does not mean stiffness. So, what's not natural is your pelvic ring being, quote unquote, parallel to the ground at all times in every single movement that you make. That's not physiological, that's not healthy, that's stiff. When we walk or run, even more intensely then, our pelvis is in a constant state of tilting slightly forward, slightly backwards. Not much. Not in the sense of whoop, whoop, in the sense of an exercise where you actually pull the pubic bone up and then drop it down. Nothing this big, but there has to be movement in order to create this dynamic wave through the whole body that both left and right, as well as front and back, balances you while walking, that balances the spine on top of it. And there is another very, very important rhythmic aspect that comes into play here, which is our breathing. And our breathing is basically this change of volume of our abdomen and our chest area due to certain muscle contraction. But breathing is a rhythmic process, and the pelvic ring is not excluded from that. If the pelvic ring is totally stiff, the lumbar spine is held totally stiff, then your breathing will be impaired. You will have a hard time to breathe in a relaxed and grounded way, and you'll have more of a chest breathing situation going on, which creates more stress. So what we need, rather than this stiffness of the pelvis always being quote unquote completely parallel to the ground, or like it happens for many people, the tailbone being pulled up because there's so much tension in the lumbar spine. So a constant anterior pelvic tilt, whatever position the pelvis is in at all times, is stiffness and not stability. So it's really important that we understand this concept. The muscles are there to work with each other. Now imagine you have this pelvic ring here, and you have, say, the hamstrings back here and the glutes back here, and then you have in front, so this would be front, this would be back, you have in front your abdominal muscles. Now, when your glutes contract, you rather pull the pelvis into a posterior pelvic tilt. This can be combined with actually contracting at the same time the abdominal muscles. Then you will intensify this tilt of the pelvis. So the diagonal, if you look at the body from the side. The antagonistic muscle groups for that would be the back muscles and the front of your thigh, so the quads basically. And that's an important thing to understand. We're talking about this crisscross pattern here. So a muscle down lower than the hip and behind, and the muscle higher than the hip and in front, they work together to facilitate the same movement. And vice versa, the muscle on top of the hip in the back and below the hip in front, they facilitate the same type of pelvic tilt when we are just talking about the front back, not even talking about the left and right. And so those muscles, they have to work with each other, because if all those four muscle areas, back, belly, glutes and hamstrings, and quads, tense at the same time, there is no movement in the hip joints, or a very limited high pressure movement in the hip joints, and the pelvic ring is very stiff. The lumbar spine is held extremely stiff and immobile. And so stiffness and stability are two very, very, very different things. Stiffness is exactly what you do not want to create. Stability is always a dynamic process based on proper muscle coordination across multiple muscle functions, across multiple muscle elements, say glutes and abdomen, say back and quads, and so on. So different muscles, they have to work with each other. That's the coordination that leads to stability, functional stability, that is immediately related to the movement that we do. If the muscles are stiff because the only thing one trained them to do is work and tense up, that's when we lose mobility. That's when we lose this dynamic stability and we move more towards the side of the coin that's called stiffness. All right, I hope this just gives you a vague idea of those two terms. Much more to say, obviously, like always. And yeah, so to sum this all up, I hope once again it was of interest to you. I think it's very important to see those possibilities. Yeah, not every single time when you have a problem in your left shoulder, do you have to work specifically on that shoulder. Work on the rest of the body potentially and actually optimize the surrounding of the shoulder, which then enables you to do more efficient, more sustainable training in this area. So this is what this video was all about. So absolutely, it is possible that with every functional and really proper, coordinative, aware, and deliberate training of muscles, you can have a positive impact on absolutely everything else in your body. I wish you a wonderful time. Have a beautiful whatever you're going to do with the rest of your day. Enjoy and let that sink in a little bit. See if you have similar experiences. If yes, amazing. But the most important thing here, again, try to perceive it. See if you can relate to that information. Become your own researcher. Check it out and see, okay, how does this feel? Can I even feel it? And that's very important. Absolutely every one of us is capable of perceiving those things. Some better, some not so good. There are some diseases, neurological diseases, that make it more difficult, but then normally the body creates a workaround of perception. So pretty much everyone is capable of perceiving how those things work and perceiving body movement having an effect on themselves. And this perception of quality of movement and of coordination, train yourself in that, because this is what creates the freedom for you. This is the core of every single thing that you can do with your own body. The conscious awareness of it. And that's worth training in itself, beyond just the physical training. Just becoming more aware instead of just counting reps. Have a beautiful time. Enjoy the rest of your day. If you haven't subscribed to the channel and you want to stay up to date with more of this, with more topics around how to become sustainable human and actually unlock everything that we as humans in a human body and consciousness and emotions and mind is actually capable of without any additional add-ons and technological support from the outside, then subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share the video if that is something you think, oh right, maybe my friend should hear that. Then awesome, it really helps a lot. Thanks a lot and see you around. Bye.